In the glittering chaos of the 1980s, some films fell so hard at the box office that studios swore never to speak their names again. Yet decades later, those same so-called disasters began to gleam like buried gold. What if the biggest flops of the decade were actually secret masterpieces waiting for redemption? Let us rewind to the reels that bombed but refused to die. Number 15. Heaven's Gate, 1980. When Michael Cimino released Heaven's Gate, it was meant to be his magnum opus after the triumph of The Deer Hunter. Instead, it became Hollywood's most infamous financial catastrophe. Critics tore it apart, calling it bloated, indulgent, and incomprehensible. United Artists lost millions, leading to the studio's collapse, and a generation of filmmakers learned the phrase "director's ego" the hard way. The story followed a Harvard graduate turned lawman facing a violent class war between European immigrants and wealthy cattle barons in Wyoming. The premise was grand, the execution excessive. Cimino rebuilt towns from scratch and demanded multiple takes for scenes no one would ever notice. When the first cut ran over 5 hours, panic spread through the boardroom like wildfire. But here is the twist. Years later, critics revisited the film and found staggering beauty beneath the rubble. Its sweeping landscapes, its moral outrage, and its haunting portrayal of America's failed dream felt prophetic. The restored version turned Heaven's Gate into a modern classic, admired by directors from Scorsese to Tarantino. What once ended an era of freewheeling creativity became its sacred tombstone, a cinematic warning that ambition can both destroy and immortalize. Number 14. The Thing, 1982. John Carpenter's The Thing arrived the same summer as E.T., and audiences wanted warmth, not paranoia. Universal expected a hit, they got empty seats. Critics called it sickening, cynical, and mean-spirited. The studio buried it quickly, embarrassed by the grotesque effects and nihilistic tone. Carpenter's career never fully recovered, at least not then. Set in a remote Antarctic base, the story followed scientists trapped with a shape-shifting alien that could mimic any living thing. The makeup effects by Rob Bottin pushed horror to limits few dared imagine, but mainstream viewers recoiled from its hopelessness, its message that trust itself was an illusion. The film's tagline, "Man is the warmest place to hide," sounded more like a curse than a promise. Years later, as VHS and cable resurrected forgotten titles, The Thing found its audience. Critics who once dismissed it called it one of the greatest sci-fi horrors ever made. Filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro and the Duffer Brothers cite it as a defining influence. Its paranoia feels more relevant than ever in a world of conspiracy and isolation. The Thing proved that sometimes failure is just genius misunderstood by its own time. Number 13. Blade Runner, 1980. 2. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner was supposed to redefine science fiction. Instead, it confused audiences and divided critics. Viewers expecting Star Wars-style adventure were met with rain-soaked gloom and existential despair. It opened to weak box office and whispers that Scott had lost his touch after Alien. Harrison Ford played Rick Deckard, a weary detective hunting humanoid replicants through a decaying Los Angeles. The film's pacing was slow, its dialogue cryptic, its ending uncertain. Warner Bros. Panicked, forcing Scott to add a voiceover and a happy conclusion that pleased no one. Blade Runner disappeared quickly, leaving behind only fragments of neon memory. Then the tide turned. As cyberpunk culture grew and directors like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve cited it as inspiration, the film's reputation soared. The 1992 director's cut removed studio meddling, revealing a haunting meditation on identity and mortality. Blade Runner became not just a movie, but a religion for dreamers of the dystopian future. Once dismissed as a dark misfire, it now defines the look and soul of science fiction itself. Blade Runner reminds us that sometimes the box office cannot measure vision, and that failure can be the first draft of immortality. Number 12. The King of Comedy, 1983. When Martin Scorsese released The King of Comedy, audiences were expecting another explosive crime saga like Taxi Driver or Raging Bull. What they got instead was a quiet, unsettling satire that made people deeply uncomfortable. The film flopped hard, grossing a fraction of its budget, and was quickly labeled one of Scorsese's strangest failures. The story followed Rupert Pupkin, a delusional aspiring comedian played by Robert De Niro, who kidnaps his talk show idol, hoping to earn his 5 minutes of fame. It was not violent like Scorsese's other films, but psychologically terrifying. The laughter was forced, the silences unbearable. Critics did not know whether to call it comedy or tragedy. Studios buried it out of confusion while audiences simply avoided it. Behind the scenes, Scorsese was exhausted, battling illness and self-doubt during production. The studio had little faith in the project, and De Niro's intense performance made some cast members uneasy. Yet decades later, the king of comedy began to look eerily prophetic. Its themes of celebrity obsession, media manipulation, and lonely delusion mirrored the rise of social media culture. Today, it stands as one of Scorsese's most daring works. The Joker film from 2019 borrowed its DNA almost entirely. What once seemed too strange for the world turned out to describe the world perfectly. The king of comedy reminds us that laughter and madness often share the same stage. Number 11. Dune, 1984. David Lynch's Dune was supposed to be the next Star Wars, a grand sci-fi epic filled with mysticism and spectacle. Instead, it became one of the biggest box office disasters of the decade. The film was ridiculed for its confusing plot and uneven pacing. Even Lynch himself disowned it, saying he lost creative control before filming was done. The story, adapted from Frank Herbert's complex novel, centered on Paul Atreides, a young noble who discovers his destiny on the desert planet Arrakis, home of the spice that controls the universe. The visuals were magnificent, the sound design surreal, but the studio forced Lynch to cut hours from his original vision. The result felt like watching a dream through shattered glass. Critics mocked it, calling it unintelligible. Audiences left theaters bewildered. Merchandising deals collapsed. Yet over time, Dune found loyal defenders. Fans praised its haunting atmosphere, its bizarre beauty, its operatic sense of doom. The movie became a cult phenomenon celebrated at midnight screenings. When Denis Villeneuve's modern adaptation arrived in the 2020s, critics finally acknowledged what Lynch attempted decades earlier, a vast myth of power, prophecy, and fate. Dune's failure was only temporary. It became proof that art too ambitious for its own era can still outlive the mockery of its debut. Number 10. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, 1988. Terry Gilliam's imagination was never small, but with The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, it nearly destroyed a studio. The film's production was chaos from start to finish, plagued by delays, weather disasters, and ballooning costs. Columbia Pictures tried to stop the bleeding, but Gilliam refused to compromise. When it finally premiered, it made less than $8 million against a $46 million budget. The film told the story of an old adventurer recounting his unbelievable tales to a young girl as their city faces siege. Flying ships, moon voyages, and surreal battles unfold in a blur of magic and melancholy. It was whimsical daring and visually breathtaking, yet executives saw only a financial nightmare. The press mocked it as indulgent excess from a director who had lost his grip on reality. But in time, viewers began to see the genius in Gilliam's madness. His vision of imagination triumphing over despair resonated with artists and dreamers worldwide. Directors like Tim Burton and Wes Anderson cite it as a visual influence. Today, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen stands as a cult legend, proof that creativity cannot always be measured in profit. It is a film that failed spectacularly, yet refused to fade quietly into history. Sometimes the most beautiful dreams are the ones that cost everything to imagine. Number 9. Big Trouble in Little China, 1986. When John Carpenter returned to the director's chair for Big Trouble in Little China, he wanted to blend kung fu fantasy with old-school adventure. The studio wanted a mainstream blockbuster. Neither got what they expected. The film tanked at the box office, earning less than half its budget, and baffling critics who could not decide if it was satire or insanity. Kurt Russell played Jack Burton, a truck driver who gets dragged into a supernatural war beneath San Francisco's Chinatown. The story mixed martial arts mysticism, ancient curses, and tongue-in-cheek humor, but its tone was too odd for summer audiences used to clean-cut heroes. The marketing department had no idea how to sell it. Some posters even hid the film's Asian mythology to attract Western viewers, which only made things worse. Production was chaotic. Studio executives clashed with Carpenter over tone and pacing. They wanted Indiana Jones-style action, while Carpenter aimed for self-aware parody. When the movie finally released, it was buried by competition from Aliens and The Fly. Yet over time, fans embraced it. Its quotable lines, practical effects, and playful spirit turned it into a cult treasure. Today, it stands as one of Carpenter's most beloved works. What once confused critics now defines his fearless originality. Big Trouble in Little China proves that sometimes failure is simply the price of being too far ahead of the curve. Number 8. The Last Starfighter, 1984. When The Last Starfighter hit theaters, Universal thought it had a hit. It was one of the first movies to use extensive computer-generated effects, promising the dawn of digital cinema. But audiences did not show up. Released just weeks after Ghostbusters and Gremlins, it was swallowed by bigger hits and dismissed as lightweight family fare. The story followed Alex Rogan, a teenager whose skill at an arcade game makes him the perfect candidate to fight an interstellar war. It was wish fulfillment for a generation raised on pixels and dreams. Yet, critics found the film naive, its dialogue wooden, and its visuals primitive. Few noticed that its use of CGI was years ahead of its time. Behind the scenes, the filmmakers were racing against technological limits. Every shot required days of computer rendering. The budget stretched thin. Studio executives panicked when they realized they were betting on technology most theaters could barely project properly. In the decades since, The Last Starfighter has become a cult favorite. Its hopeful tone, its pioneering digital artistry, and its heartwarming message about destiny have earned it new life through fan restorations and sequel rumors. It may have bombed in 1984, but its influence lives in every CGI spectacle that followed. The Last Starfighter taught Hollywood that even digital dreams begin with human wonder. Number 7. The Abyss, 1989. James Cameron had already conquered box offices with The Terminator and Aliens when he decided to film an underwater science fiction epic. The Abyss became one of the most grueling productions in cinema history. It ran months behind schedule and nearly drowned both its cast and its finances. When it premiered, it barely broke even, leaving Cameron disillusioned and exhausted. The plot centered on deep-sea oil workers who encounter an alien intelligence beneath the ocean floor. The film mixed military tension with emotional intimacy between estranged lovers played by Ed Harris and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. But audiences expecting explosions found a slow, introspective drama instead. Behind-the-camera conditions were brutal. Actors spent hours submerged in freezing tanks. Crew members quit in exhaustion. Rumors spread of tempers flaring and near drownings. Critics admired the visuals but found the pacing uneven. Yet in the director's cut released years later, Cameron's full vision emerged, a moving meditation on human fear and empathy. Today, The Abyss is celebrated as a cornerstone of modern visual effects and the film that prepared Cameron for Titanic. What once seemed like a costly experiment now feels visionary. It reminded the world that beneath chaos and pressure, diamonds are born. Number 6. Tron, 1982. When Tron premiered, Disney believed it would redefine cinema. The idea of stepping inside a computer seemed revolutionary, yet audiences in 1982 were not ready for cyberspace. The movie struggled at the box office, and critics dismissed it as cold and mechanical. Disney quietly pulled the plug on its sequel plans, calling it a costly experiment that no one understood. The film followed a computer programmer named Kevin Flynn, who becomes digitized and trapped inside a glowing neon world ruled by a tyrannical system. Inside this digital gladiator arena, programs were living beings fighting for survival. The visual design was decades ahead of its time, mixing live action with computer animation unlike anything before it. But those same visuals confused viewers unfamiliar with the digital age. Behind the scenes, the crew faced overwhelming technical challenges. Computers were so primitive that some scenes had to be hand-animated to mimic digital graphics. The process took years and drained resources. The Academy even refused to nominate Tron for visual effects, claiming the filmmakers had cheated by using computers. Yet over time, Tron became a touchstone for the future of digital filmmaking. It inspired generations of programmers and filmmakers, including Pixar's founders and video game designers. When Tron Legacy revived the story decades later, it proved the original had never truly died. What the world once rejected as sterile became a glowing prophecy of the digital frontier. Number 5. Streets of Fire, 1984. When Walter Hill released Streets of Fire, he called it a rock and roll fable. The tagline alone baffled audiences. It was part musical, part action film, part comic book fantasy. The studio spent millions promoting it as the next big franchise. But when it arrived, theaters were empty. Critics labeled it all style, no soul. It was gone within weeks. The story opened with a kidnapped singer and a mercenary ex-lover who rides back into town to rescue her from a gang of biker outlaws. The world looked half 1950s, half post-apocalyptic dreamscape. Neon signs burned through constant rain. Fire escapes and jukeboxes glowed like memories of a world that never was. Production was bold and chaotic. The soundtrack featured artists like Dan Hartman and Fire Inc. But even that could not save it. The release clashed with Ghostbusters and Gremlins, both massive hits. The studio panicked and pulled the film early. Yet years later, fans rediscovered it. The mix of music and melancholy inspired filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Edgar Wright. Its influence echoes in everything from Drive to Baby Driver. Streets of Fire was too weird to live in 1984, but too unique to die in silence. It remains a cult anthem for outsiders who dream in neon. Number 4. The Iron Giant, 1999. Though technically closing out the decade, The Iron Giant was born from the 80s spirit of misunderstood brilliance. Warner Bros. Barely marketed it. Competing against flashy blockbusters, it bombed spectacularly. Critics praised its heart, but the audience never came. The film made less than a third of its budget and disappeared within weeks. Directed by Brad Bird, it told the story of a young boy in 1957 who befriends a giant robot from space. Together, they hide from government agents who fear what they do not understand. It was both a Cold War allegory and a love letter to innocence, but the studio saw it as a children's cartoon and gave it little support. Behind the scenes, Bird fought for creative control using traditional animation in an era obsessed with computer graphics. The marketing team barely knew how to sell it. Test screenings amazed audiences, yet no one could find it in theaters. Years later, it became a cult phenomenon through home video and word of mouth. Directors like Brad Bird and J.J. Abrams cite it as proof that sincerity never goes out of style. The Iron Giant may have failed at release, but it became a legend of empathy, imagination, and courage, a film that taught generations that you are who you choose to be. Number 3. The Shawshank Redemption, 1994. Though often remembered as a 90s classic, The Shawshank Redemption carried the scars of the 80s cinematic optimism and the same tragic fate of being ignored on release. When it opened, it was crushed by heavy competition, including Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump. It earned little profit and disappeared quickly from theaters. For Warner Bros., it was considered a failure that made no sense. The story followed Andy Dufresne, a quiet banker wrongly imprisoned for murder, and his friendship with fellow inmate Red over decades inside Shawshank Prison. It was about hope, about endurance, and the small acts of rebellion that keep a soul alive. But audiences at the time found it too slow, too quiet, and too bleak. The title itself confused viewers. Many skipped it entirely. Behind the scenes, director Frank Darabont poured his heart into every frame, adapting Stephen King's novella with poetic precision. Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman delivered masterclass performances, but the marketing campaign did not know how to sell a film without romance or explosions. Then came Redemption. Home video and television reruns transformed Shawshank into one of the most beloved films of all time. Viewers who missed it in theaters discovered its profound humanity, and word spread. Today, it tops countless best film lists and remains a symbol of persistence in art. The Shawshank Redemption taught the world that box office numbers are temporary, but hope is forever. Number 2. Scarface, 1983. When Brian De Palma's Scarface hit theaters, critics loathed it. They called it excessive, vulgar, and empty. Censors nearly banned it for its violence. Universal feared backlash from moral groups and trimmed scenes reluctantly before release. The result was chaos at the box office. Some theaters refused to show it. Many critics walked out before the ending. The story followed Tony Montana, a Cuban immigrant who claws his way to power in Miami's drug underworld. Al Pacino's performance was volcanic, but audiences were unsure whether to admire or despise him. The violence, the decadence, the surreal tone all blurred together into something grotesque yet hypnotic. The film made modest money, but far less than expected, and was widely considered a failure. Behind the scenes, Pacino injured himself during filming, and De Palma fought constant censorship battles. Even the Motion Picture Association threatened an X rating. Yet over the years, Scarface became a cultural phenomenon. Hip-hop artists quoted its lines, fans worshipped its defiance, and critics eventually recognized it as a grand operatic tragedy about ambition and corruption. What once felt too loud, too crude, too vulgar, now reads like prophecy. In an age of greed and spectacle, Scarface became the mirror none of us could ignore. It was never a movie about success, but a warning about obsession disguised as glory. Number 1. Once Upon a Time in America, 1984. When Sergio Leone released Once Upon a Time in America, it was meant to be his grand farewell, a sweeping gangster epic spanning decades of friendship, betrayal, and regret. Instead, it became a studio nightmare. Executives butchered his 4-hour vision down to 2, turning a masterpiece into a puzzle. Critics called it incoherent. Audiences left confused. Leone never made another film. The story followed childhood friends rising from New York's slums to power, only to be undone by greed and memory. Robert De Niro's performance as Noodles was meant to ache with sorrow, but the chopped version lost its soul. Reviewers dismissed it as indulgent chaos. Years of Leone's devotion were reduced to fragments. Then came redemption. In the 1990s, the restored director's cut revealed what had been lost, a poetic meditation on time, guilt, and innocence. Critics rewatched and gasped. The same film once mocked as a mess was hailed as a masterpiece. Its mournful music, hypnotic rhythm, and dreamlike imagery earned it the reverence it always deserved. Once Upon a Time in America reminds us that some failures aren't failures at all, just masterpieces waiting for the world to catch up. Every so-called failure hides a masterpiece waiting for rediscovery. These films remind us that art cannot always be measured by money or headlines. Some stories need time to breathe before they find their audience. Which of these misunderstood gems deserves a second chance on your screen tonight? Like, share, and subscribe for more untold cinematic resurrections.